Well, hello, class. This is Dr. Beloff. So, this is a brief lecture for you on in our week number 4 work to emphasize a few points in regard to the use of these strategy frameworks that we are continuing to learn about as you read through the chapter in the book, and also to add some context to these frameworks. One of the things I like about the book is that it's the only text that I could find, quite frankly, that not only focuses on healthcare strategy, but focuses on analysis using particular strategy frameworks. It does a very, very good job of articulating the breadth of the toolbox, so to speak. I don't know that it does a great job of helping the student embrace or to integrate into a comprehensive framework for, well, how do you use these models and how do you contextualize them, and probably most importantly, which ones do you select to apply to your own organization or in fact to yourself. So what I try to do in these lectures is to focus a little bit more about that rather than simply explaining or regurgitating what's covered in the text on the actual frameworks and how they work and how you would fill them in and so forth. And the exercises that we do are designed to help you get some practice in that regard also. So here we go. Now, I wanted to go back to this particular diagram, which I really like from my old buddy Henry Mintzberg, where he, if you may recall, he created the 10 schools of strategy, or more accurately, what he did was he looked at the strategy literature that had developed from the 1960s on and effectively tried to provide a superstructure or a taxonomy, as academics call it, of where all these particular theories fit in and how they're related to each other. And what I liked about this particular diagram is it talks about a number of, or basically puts the schools, the different perspectives on strategy, on a grid and uses the axes of internal processes, and in other words, focusing on what's going on inside the organization, and then looking at the external world, and then also using this whole notion of what's predictable, in other words, what's the external world like out there. You know, certain views in strategy are that the external world is controllable. We can understand it all, you can control for it. All you have to do is manipulate our internal world, i.e. the organizational elements, and we'll be okay. Another view says, good luck with that. While we should do some planning, we should not count on our planning being perfectly accurate, and so the world out there is very, very confusing, threatening, changing all the time. And so what we really ought to focus on, as opposed to planning and positioning, would be if you go all the way to the right of this quadrant up here, it would be effectively to, give the organization, develop the organization's ability to react, to learn, to be effective, impactful, because after all, the external world's not controllable. You could see how, as we go through the frameworks that were developed by folks who believed in this particular view of reality, that these frameworks kind of fit into certain categories. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next few slides to emphasize some of the frameworks and how they connect to the underlying theory about how strategy is made. So remember, one of the things I love about the strategy diamond is it is not tied to a particular strategy theory per se, or even a view of strategy, how it should be formulated, how the external environment is. In other words, is it unpredictable or predictable? And it really isn't even focused much on the internal organization. It really just simply poses a series of questions in order to test the validity or the comprehensiveness of your strategy. So irrespective of your world, the way you see the world, irrespective of the way you decide you're going to develop a strategy, what I love about the strategy diamond is it's agnostic. It simply says, have you answered these questions? And if you've answered these questions, at least we know you have a complete strategy. It doesn't necessarily tell us whether it's going to be effective or not, although in my experience, if you use this rigorously, by the time you get done, if you have flaws in your strategy, missing elements, gaps, or elements in a strategy that sort of run against each other, the strategy diamond will, generally speaking, point these out. That's one of the reasons I ask you to, whenever we're doing a case or an exercise, when we do a case at the end of the course, but when we do these exercises, which are like mini cases, always take the strategy diamond out and try to fill it in as you're going through the case. Because then what you very much will realize is that either the case writer hasn't provided information, or in some cases, in these cases, it's clear that the organization hasn't asked these questions, or they haven't answered these questions appropriately, or they're not even thinking about them. Okay, so this is my my go-to frame. That's why it's so brilliant. So sorry, the authors never really followed up and continued to write about this, because I think they just really did a superb job. Now let's talk about the external focus, and what I mean by that is strategy frameworks in theories, and then frameworks that are built on theories that kind of focus more on the external world. And we in last week's readings, you got exposed to a number of those, but I just want to go back over them because they're useful for understanding the internal focus that we're spending time on this week. So Porter's set of frameworks and his entire perspective is very useful for typifying what I would call the focus on the external. You know, as we said before, Porter effectively says there's an industry and you're in an industry. You know, you might be in several industries, but if you produce a number of products, you might be in several industries. But irrespective of that, there's this outside world that you need to analyze. And this outside world constrains, in many ways, what you can do. And I won't go back over this model, but you can see here that Porter's saying, figure out what's going on outside, define the industry, and figure out what they're doing and what they're not doing, and what will be your range of options, if you will. So again, Porter's focus, of course, has been there's an industry, we belong in the industry, and our choices are limited and constrained by this particular industry. Later on, when we talk about the blue ocean strategy and other forms of strategies that are predominantly focused internally, you'll see that view changes. But in any event, now what is interesting is that Porter also goes on to say, listen, because you have an outside world that's constrained, you also have a world that's constrained internally, and there are only so many things, activities as he calls them, that you can manipulate in this world. And conveniently, because Porter is an engineer, he's provided a nice diagram. You can see he split them up between primary and supporting. And he says basically these are the things you can manipulate once you decide that you have a strategy. So now, of course, Porter has a formula for that too. And what he says effectively is, look, there are only 3 generic strategies. There are only so many things you can do. You can be a cost leader. You can have differentiation. You can have only a differentiated process or focus, or you can have a cost focus. You don't want to get stuck in the middle. What does it mean really? It's like, well, you can be Walmart, or you can be a high-end merchandising organization. Okay, and there isn't any middle of the road, so to speak. You're either going to be working on cost, of course, Walmart, low prices every day, or you're going to be working on differentiation. And so if you're competing against Walmart, you're going to not really worry about price so much. You're going to produce all the different elements that Walmart doesn't produce. Now, we know in reality, there are organizations that try to walk the line, so to speak. That is to say, if you look at Target, or Target as it's often called, you realize that Target doesn't ignore price, but they try to distinguish themselves from Walmart by virtue of having a higher end clientele and having a higher end product line. Okay, so their clothing, for example, in theory would be nicer than the ones at Walmart. Their customers would be perhaps higher income individuals and so forth. So there are organizations who do in fact play the middle ground and seem to do okay. All right, that would be true, by the way, with Dunkin' Donuts versus Starbucks. Dunkin' Donuts doesn't compete entirely on price. They actually have moved into the middle to try to blunt Starbucks's growth, and have been fairly successful at it. But in any event, Porter says that's not doable. You only have several choices and you have to choose, and if you get stuck in the middle, that's quite bad. Now let's look at the internal focus. So we're going to talk a little bit about different models that effectively incorporate or focus on the internal world. It doesn't mean that the external world is excluded, but these particular models are really all about what's going on inside the organization. They don't really spend much time thinking about the outside world. The McKinsey 7S model, which is quite good, I reckon you read the chapter certainly about that in the textbook, does a nice job of talking about what is it about an organization that makes it effective. And so the model here, let me go to my graph, which is even better, is in McKinsey's model is we look at these things that are a part of strategy, but are also separate from strategy in terms of the quality and the skills and the abilities. You could think of this as a multi-dimensional half side of the SWOT. In other words, what are our strengths and weaknesses, but languaged and structured in a slightly different fashion. So you can see here there's some soft skill stuff that goes on inside this particular diagram. It doesn't really talk about financial resources. It talks about resources like staffing and how we have the staff organized and what our culture is like. I call that shared values. How good we are, what our knowledge is. That's our skill sets perhaps. Systems would also be in the area of skill sets and knowledge, and style, which would probably be part of culture. You can see that there's some packaging or some overlap that goes on inside of the internal schools. This particular one is not talking about, in particular, what our capital reserves are and so forth. It doesn't really encompass that, interestingly enough. Now, there's another model called the life cycle analysis. This is an internal model for the most part, but it's an interesting one in the sense of it says, listen, whether you have a product or an organization or even an industry, these all go through predictable life cycles of birth, growth, maturity, revival, and decline. Okay, and you should understand that your organization or your industry is in some element of that, or a product that you might have. Let's say you're a health system and you say, in regard to our primary care delivery model that we're going to have, we're going to go through this. So for a lot of healthcare organizations, they're in the birth and growth of that. Hospitals have not been in the delivery of primary care very long. That in the last decade or two, they've been buying primary care practices and learning, in theory, how to do this. And soon they'll reach a maturity maturity and revival cycle. But ultimately, primary care delivered by large health hospital systems will decline. Is that true? I don't know. I suppose if you're the author of the life cycle analysis, one of the things you can always say is, well, we haven't waited long enough, so eventually everything will decline. We'll see. We'll see if that's true. Now, again, sticking with the theme, if you will, of typology. You know, the Boston Consulting Group brought their own model, if you will, to effectively look at products and industries and so forth, and basically to typify where you are as an organization, where your product is, and based on where it is, there would be specific strategies that you might employ. And lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about the organizational cultural analysis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the articles I posted, which address this issue of the resource-based view of the firm and resource-based strategy, if you will, and then also the knowledge-based view of the firm. And basically, these two are, in my opinion, sort of very connected at the hip. The entire sort of grouping of theories, strategy theories, that are centered around the organization itself rather than the external world, and says effectively, listen, it's really all about the organization's, its skills, its capabilities, its resources. They can all be manipulated in such a way to develop effective strategies. The organizational culture school says that's really the first, last, and always go-to element in trying to figure out an effective strategy and then to implement that strategy. So the story goes, if you have strong cultures, they're positive cultures, they produce great results, and the rest of the things that we pay attention to sort of happen on their own, you know? In other words, you know, if we have a great culture, we're going to build all the robust capabilities that we need, obtain the right resources that we're going to need, come up with the right strategies. You know, it's all about culture. This particular theory became very popular with Tom Peters and In Search of Excellence, popularity in the 1980s. He went out and found organizations that were excelling, and he looked very much at what are the cultures of these organizations, and he went to Motorola and a number of other organizations that were very successful at the time, Hewlett-Packard, and he said basically these organizations have strong cultures, which creates the excellence that we see evidenced over the last 2 decades. The problem with that theory, if you will, was the inability effectively to sort of, in some sense, prove that. I mean, you can take a snapshot of an organization and say, it's all about the culture here, that's why the results are great. The problem is that, as Tom Peters admitted about 10 years later, many of the organizations that he featured in Search of Excellence came upon some very, very hard times. Xerox, Motorola, Eastman Kodak, you know, a number of these organizations within a decade or two were in serious trouble, or in some cases literally almost gone. And so it sort of eroded the whole focus of organizational culture as the key strategic element in superior performance. Now, that said, paying attention to culture matters, and you can see here the snapshot here of organizational cultural analysis. This particular author in the book uses Starbucks as an example of an organization that has a strong culture, and it appears that in fact that may in fact be their strategy. I would opine that it's an element of the strategy. No question in my mind that in order to create the mood that Starbucks likes to create, which apparently is successful with their customer niche, that they have to have the right culture to deliver the right experience in order to deliver the right product in order to be successful, which they've clearly been at. And one could argue that would be true of Dunkin' Donuts, who competes with Starbucks. But it clearly is not the only thing. There have been other coffee chains that have tried to do exactly what Starbucks has done. They've created great cultures. They haven't succeeded. So clearly, while organizational fit is important to Starbucks' success, it's clearly not the only element. All of the other elements we talk about in terms of what makes a powerful company also matter. Okay. So I'd like to close with just a couple of comments, if you will, and that has to do with the resource and the knowledge views of strategy. I posted a couple of articles about this and on these two views, which are probably the newest strategy theories that have been hatched in the last 20 years or so, unfortunately. Now, the newest, I would say, the absolute newest one that has gained some traction is the value innovation blue ocean strategy. But prior to that particular work in the early 2000s, the resource view and the knowledge view were very popular. I'll just talk briefly about them, and we'll go from there. So the resource view, which is, as I said, developed probably in the 90s and 2000s, got a lot of traction in academia and to some degree in the business world, was that really it's all about the firm's resources. That ultimately what makes a firm strategically successful is the degree to which they have access to resources and how they deploy them, how skillful they are in deploying said resources. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is, of course, in theory, this would be a virtuous cycle. That is to say, to the degree that an organization is successful, and we'll use, let's say, financial success as the surrogate, then it actually increases its financial capital, which enhances its resources and also gives the firm the ability to use that financial capital to obtain or to develop the other resources, whether that be human capital, systems, processes, knowledge. And so, it's a logical theory and it fits together quite well. Of course, it leaves, I guess, a large question in the sense of that's fine, but how does one actually do that? It's very, very easy to articulate that what this is about is the management of resources, but it doesn't necessarily help you much in regard to how does one do that. If you don't have financial capital, then you have to go out and figure out a way to do that, and then simultaneously you have to figure out a way to use that capital wisely in order to manage all the other resources. So this view of the firm from a strategic standpoint is interesting, but doesn't tell us a lot about what to do in order to either obtain these resources or what to do once we have obtained them. It's like, well, all right, now that we're very successful and so forth, we still have to make an ongoing effort to develop strategies. And how do we do that? So then you're kind of back to square one. So what is true, however, is that what's nice about the resource view is it's another way to look at your strengths and your weaknesses. So in that sense, it fits nicely into the SWOT model, if you will. And what you may be starting to appreciate as we go through these different frames and models is the SWOT and the strategy diamond are sort of the granddaddy, or you might want to call them the core strategic frameworks. Ultimately, at the end of the day, an organization kind of has to know what it's good at, strengths, what it's weak at, weaknesses, whether or not those are strategically relevant, and whether we need to work on a weakness or to capitalize on a strength. You may even have to diminish a strength because it's not strategically relevant. Let's spend a little less time getting very good at this because we're already great at it, and we'll deploy some resources to get better at our weaknesses. So you can see that the resource view might be kind of just not necessarily its standalone strategy theory, but one that fits in nicely with other theories, if you will. And that certainly goes for doubly for the knowledge view. I could easily make the argument that really the knowledge view of strategy is simply a subset of the resource view. Now, I won't belabor the point The knowledge view was very hot in the early 2000s with the publication of Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, sorry, and with the advent of things called learning organizations. Learning organizations have really struggled. It's one of the reasons I posted the article that I did. It's sort of a theory in search of itself, and really, in my view, really just belongs as an element of the resource view. Yes, an organization does need to pay attention to what we might call captured knowledge. That is to say, there's ways of doing things, knowledge about, knowledge how, that exist in an organization and largely exist in the heads of the employees, to be quite honest. And one of the distressing things is when one of your great employees walks out the door with knowledge that only he or she possesses. And so the knowledge view spends a lot of time talking about how can we capture that knowledge in databases and systems and processes and in patents and so forth, licenses, so that the organization can retain this knowledge, so that it is not subject to or to the risk of Jane having a heart attack and dying and being the only person who knows how to do that thing, and so forth. So again, I won't beat this particular thing to death, but simply say that you will come across these theories if you spend any time studying strategy, and I wanted you to understand sort of a context for where they belong. And with that, I'll end the slide lecture show here, and hope that you found this useful. Thank you.